Hello and welcome back to Tranquility du Jour, nourishing conversations about living a full and meaningful life with doses of tranquility. Episode 503. I'm your host, Kimberly Wilson, bringing you tranquility since 2005. Next month is our 15-year anniversary. Today, we're talking with the lovely Brad Warner, a Zen teacher, about his recent book, Letters to a Dead Friend About Zen. We discuss Zen practice as a lifeline in a difficult world, what he wished he'd shared with his friend about spirituality and meditation, and how the book is a unique tribute to both a life lost and the one that Warner found. Oh, and his passion as a punk bassist. For those of you new to Tranquility du Jour, a big welcome, and be sure to hit the subscribe button in your favorite podcast app, Spotify, Apple Podcast, or Overcast, and you'll find a link to this in the show notes, which can be found at kimberlywilson.com/503. For more episodes, download the Tranquility du Jour podcast app available for iPhone and Android. And also find more at kimberlywilson.com/podcast. Now, our next gathering is going to be happening on a Sunday, September 20th from 8 to 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and it's our fall TDJ Live, which is a seasonal event where we get together as a community via YouTube Live, and I share 8 new tips for tranquility in the fall season. Now, also in probably October-ish, I'm going to be launching a new e-course called TDJ Lifestyle, focusing all on the 5 Tranquility du Jour tenets. And there's a link in the show notes to join the waitlist. Also, the last event that I have scheduled is January 1st, 2021, which I can't believe we're already talking about January, but it's the New Year's virtual retreat. And would love to have you join, and there's a link to find out more also in the show notes. Brad Warner is the author of Letters to a Dead Friend About Zen and numerous other titles, including It Came From Beyond Zen, Don't Be a Jerk, and Hardcore Zen. A Soto Zen teacher, he is also a punk bassist, filmmaker, and popular blogger who leads workshops and retreats around the world. In addition to his books, his writing appears in Lion's Roar, Tricycle, Buddha Dharma, and Alternative Press. He lives in Los Angeles, where he is the founder and lead teacher of the Angel City Zen Center. Visit him at hardcorezen.info. Welcome, Brad.
Hello.
So, congrats on your latest book, Letters to a Dead Friend About Zen.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, it's so beautiful. And, I'd love to hear a little bit more, and I know you probably get this question all the time with regard to the book, but why a dead friend? Like, what brought this up for you that you're like, oh, now I want to tell my friend all about Buddhism?
Well, yeah, that's well. The book is about this tour I did of Europe when I've been touring Europe every year since 2009, and in 2014, a friend of mine, two friends of mine actually, who I sort of truncated in terms of the book into one person, were both dying of cancer, and they were both people I'd known since high school, and one of them I was closer to than the other because one I'd kind of lost contact with. But I was in contact with the one guy all through the tour, just writing him emails and contacting him on Facebook. I visited him a couple of times during his illness, and by the time I went on this tour, the news was getting pretty bad. And he was 2 years younger than me, so he's in his late 40s. And I knew the end was coming, and I'd kind of he had known me pretty much throughout the time that I'd been interested in practicing Zen, but he knew me from a completely different part of my life, which was he was part of this sort of, like I think I just said, the punk rock scene that I was also part of in those days. So, I don't think we'd ever talked about the Zen stuff. And here he was dying, and Zen is supposed to be about the great matter of life and death, and I wasn't sure, how to talk to him about that stuff or if he wanted to talk about it. And my feeling is if I'm dying, of some terrible disease, the last thing I want is some old friend of mine coming along and trying to convert me at the last minute to his religion. So I didn't want to be that guy. I wanted to kind of let it come up organically if it was going to come up at all. But it never really did. We had a few, several conversations while he knew he was dying, but I don't think we ever got into the subject of anything religious or spiritual at all during that time. I just decided I'm just going to be a friend to him. But after he died, it sort of really hit me, all of the things I should have said or could have said, and how I could have gotten into it. And I don't feel like I did the wrong thing by not talking about it when he was dying, because I feel like that was how it had to go. But I also felt like he was somebody who could have understood and benefited from this practice and this philosophy that I've been studying, but there was no way for him to get into it because it was just so outside of his, the way he viewed life and all that stuff. And I felt like, well, there's got to be a lot of people like that. There's a lot of people I know in my life who are like that, and I feel like this practice could be greatly beneficial, but you have to be careful about presenting these sorts of things, because if you present them the wrong way, you just turn everybody off, and it doesn't amount to anything. And in Zen, there's a kind of a tradition of not speaking about Zen until somebody specifically asks you. And the reason is because until somebody's ready to ask about it, they're probably not ready to understand it anyway. So that's kind of where the book took off from.
Well, and tell us a little bit about, so you're in Hamburg, Germany, and
Hmm.
you find out he has passed away,
Yeah,
and you have to go then give a talk.
yeah.
And that's incredibly challenging. And so I'm wondering what did you pull from to be able to do that? And how did that talk go?
Gosh, that's a good question, because I was at that point I'd started carrying a little voice recorder, so I'm sure there's a recording of that talk. Actually, a friend of mine found a recording of a talk like a week later that he thought was really good. This guy who runs my podcast, but what I remember of that is just really not wanting to do it, because it's kind of written about in the book. I didn't have to do a talk the night that I heard he died, but I had it set up for the next day, so the next evening I was going to have to give this talk. And I just thought, oh, it's the last thing I want to do, because I felt like this, there was something really heavy going on in my personal life. But I'm also, I've also got an obligation to the people who came to see me. And I'm sure I talked about his death that night, because I know I talked about it in a few of the subsequent talks, and how, what it meant to me. It's just hard to get through that, and it's something that's come up before, because I've been doing these talks and things for more than 10 years now. My first book came out in 2004 or so, or 2003 actually. So I've been doing it at least since then, and a lot of stuff has come up, including my mother's death a few years before that, and it's just, I want to make this stuff relevant, because I got into Zen because I felt it was deeply relevant to my life, and I didn't get into it because I'd kind of converted to some sort of a religion that answered all the questions. That's one of the things about Zen, is it presents you with a lot of questions rather than presenting you with a lot of answers, and that's one of the things I really value about it, because any answer you're presented with on great subjects like life and death and the meaning of everything, they're always very silly and shallow, if you ask me. But when you can kind of ask these questions of yourself and work with them, you can get somewhere very interesting that doesn't necessarily lead to a pat sort of answer that you can kind of rattle off in, 3 short sentences. So I don't remember what I said actually. I just kind of, um, I just remember not wanting to do it, but doing it anyway. And that's kind of one of the lessons of Zen you get is this ability to do that, to realize, well, my role in this moment is what it is, whether that's what I want to do or whether that's what I feel like doing or not. I'm just going to have to kind of dive in and do this thing. So I know I got through the talk. I don't remember exactly what I said.
Well, one of the pieces too, if we can just kind of back up with this, is describing,
Hmm.
okay, what is Zen Buddhism, right? So
Hmm.
you're in the punk scene, I guess, in California, right? And then you find Zen?
Well, yeah, it was in Ohio, actually. I grew up
Oh,
mostly in Northeast Ohio around Akron. So yeah, the punk scene there was much smaller and much less accepted, so it was really kind of literally a battle sometimes. In my first book, I tell about this riot that happened during one of our shows, because the audience was not ready for what we did. But I came across Zen around the same time. It's a little bit fuzzy to me because it was so long ago, but I was a student at Kent State University in Ohio, where the shootings happened in 1970, and this was a long time after that. But I was interested vaguely in. I think I was a philosophy major at the time, and I was frustrated because there wasn't much about Eastern philosophy, and I'd grown up partly in Africa. When I was a kid, my family, we lived in Kenya for about 4 years, and I'd been exposed to, there was people imagine that Kenya, because of all this stuff that went around during the Obama administration, they imagine Kenya is a Muslim country, and it is not. It is mostly a Christian country, but there's a large Hindu minority there from India, and I'd been exposed to that. And found it fascinating and wanted to learn about it, but the only thing I could find was this class called Zen Buddhism. Excuse me, and I just signed up for this class, not really thinking it was gonna, I thought it'd be interesting. I hoped it would be interesting, but that's about all I expected out of it. And it just, I remember hearing the Heart Sutra, which is the excuse me, the major text that Zen Buddhists chant. And it's a very short thing. The whole thing can fit on a single page of, A4 size paper or letter size paper. And I just heard that and just thought, wow, this is what I want to learn about, because it had this phrase, form is emptiness, emptiness is form, and I had no idea what that phrase meant. But when it came to that, because we all sort of recited it aloud on the first day of class, because that's what Zen Buddhists do, and the teacher was kind of interested in doing that. And I just remember I was almost in tears when that phrase came up, because I thought, this is right, but I have no idea what it means. And I just started pursuing. There was a very simple sort of meditation you could do called Zazen, and I started doing that every day. And I didn't make a big thing out of it. I didn't sort of style myself at the time as like, "Hi, I'm into Zen Buddhism," and I just did it as part of a daily routine, and kept that up for years. And then eventually I moved to Japan uh, to get an English teaching job, not because of the Zen thing. And while I was in Japan, I met another teacher who was, after I'd studied and practiced with him for a few years, again, all is kind of a little clandestine project that I didn't really make a big deal out of. But my teacher really thought I should ordain, and I talked about this in the book, but I thought that was a dumb idea for me to ordain as a Buddhist monk. But I did it anyway, and he provided a kind of way I could keep my sort of secular life going, and not go into a monastery. But it's kind of complicated how it works in Zen. So I did this ordination, and then I wrote a book about it, and now I've written 8 books about it, which was a totally unexpected thing. I didn't expect to become a writer of books about Zen, but here I am. you know.
and I'm curious, how does the bass playing still tie, how is that still a part of this?
Oh, I don't know. I just love playing bass. Zero Defects, the band I'm in. I was a guitar player, and then they didn't need a guitar player, but they needed a bass player, and I'm like, okay, I'll do that. And I just love doing it. And the way it connects with the Zen thing is that one of the places that I found what my teacher would call the balanced state. I found it through the practice of Zazen, the meditation we do, and also through playing bass, because I think the reason is that when you're playing on stage in any genre of music, including hardcore punk, which is what this band I'm in plays, uh, you have to have a certain level of concentration and commitment. And in order to do that, you can't think about what you're doing. You can't think about what comes next in the song, or you're just going to mess up the part you're playing now. And so you have to kind of get into this mindset where you're paying very, very close attention to what you're doing, but you're not thinking about it, which is very much the mindset you're trying to cultivate in Zen practice. So I think they're very much related in that way. But as my teacher always said, he said there's a lot of ways to get to the balanced state, but he said Zazen is the easiest way. This is what he claimed. And even though Zazen isn't always easy, it's a lot easier than lugging a bass amp up 10 flights of stairs to a gig where you're only going to get paid $5. So
Right.
in a way it's a lot easier.
And when you say zazen, just for our listeners who may not know what that means, can you
Yeah.
explain?
Yeah, I used to avoid calling it meditation because I think it's different from what most people think of as meditation. But these days I kind of just say, okay, it's a type of meditation because that's what it looks like. You're sitting, usually cross-legged. You don't really have to take the cross-legged position, but you're sitting on a cushion with your back straight, and you're keeping this very strict posture and staying very still. The way it differs from most forms of what people think of as meditation is that there's no object to it. So you're not trying to become mindful or calm or have an enlightenment experience or clear your mind or any of the things that you usually associate with meditation. You're actually just trying to purely sit, which is I lived in Japan for 11 years, and it's one of these sort of lovely Japanese ascetic sort of ideas of just trying to get into the purity of one single experience. And a lot of that comes from the Zen tradition, how it's influenced Japanese culture over the years. But that's what you're trying to do. And it's I don't know if it sounds easy. I like to say it's easier said than done, because you're just trying to sit. And by doing that, you can open yourself up to a whole world of experience that you don't ordinarily realize, because you're doing the most boring thing in the world, which is sitting still, and you're facing a wall and keeping your eyes open. In Zen, we keep our eyes open, unlike a lot of meditation traditions. And so you're just looking at this wall, which is the least interesting thing in the world. But in order to do that in a pure form, what you discover is that sitting still and looking at a wall is a whole world of experience going on that is going on throughout all of your experience during the day, but you don't notice it. There's this whole undercurrent of just the bare fact of being alive that is amazing. And we often take it for granted because it's just sort of the backdrop to the other things that we think are more important. So that's the shortest version of Zazen I can come up with right now.
Well, and I think it's so interesting to give the description of like just sitting there and doing nothing and looking at a wall, and and you're like, I mean, no one is bored anymore. No, everybody, it's like we're on our phones, or we're like rushing from one place to the next, or we're planning. And so to actually hit that pause button and sit and look at a wall, it's like, oh my God, And I guess the idea with this, with there not being an object, is that do you kind of practice playing the observer of the mind? Is that kind of what you mean to just sit and notice what comes up?
Yeah, I mean, that's a fair way of putting it. If I was going to be really all Zen on you, which I'm not going to do in an interview, I'd be like, no, it's not even that, because that's kind of the way Zen teachers are. They tend to be characterized as very harsh people, but they're not really that harsh. That it's just a kind of way of trying to get you out of your normal way of thinking. So yes, you're right. You're sort of going into the observer, but if you're going to be a pure Zenny about it, you'd say, oh, I'm not even doing that. I'm just trying to even throw away any conception of what it is that I'm doing and just do it. That's the interesting part. But honestly, what you end up doing is kind of observing quietly all of the things that are going on, and it's pretty amazing. That there's so much happening just in this very still state. And you don't even have to be free of thought. And when people often feel like they're doing Zen practice wrong if they're thinking about something or if they're kind of getting distracted. But even the distractions are part of the practice, and you just notice, oh, look, I'm being distracted now. Oh, look, I wish I could look at Facebook right now. It's anything that comes across is just more part of the whole experience, and you just let it all happen.
Well, and this ties into my next question about one of your chapters, which is the goal of having no goals, right? So, I think if we do get all Zen-like about this, how do we set a goal of having no goals and still progressing, particularly around now? It's like kind of New Year's resolution time and what have you. So how do you teach that and work with that?
It's a good question because, I was I suppose the reason my teacher wanted me to ordain is he felt I had understood how to do that myself. And then now it was my job to try to convey that to other people. But I'd been practicing for, 15 or more years, even before this question of ordaining came about. So I don't know. Linguistically speaking, and I put this in the book, you could say the goal of having no goal is still a goal. And I put that to my first teacher. I had a teacher in America, too, who's still alive. My other teacher, the Japanese one, has passed away. And he said, well, yeah, grammatically speaking, that's true. But if you actually sit with the idea of making having no goal your goal, it's really, really different from any other sort of goal you could have. Just so you're just constantly putting away any time something comes up in your mind, like I should be doing this, or this experience should be, however, whatever your mind throws up at you to say you're doing it incorrectly or whatever that is, you just put it aside. It's another distraction. So no matter what the distraction is, or no matter how legitimate the distractions that your mind comes up with seem to be, you just put them aside and keep doing the practice, and you just do that over and over again until the bell rings and you're done. You can go do something else.
Yeah, that's it is. I don't know. I just find this really interesting. I think my only exposure to Zen was at the Upaya meditation or like Zen Center, in Santa Fe.
Yeah, I know that place. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and I was there for a writing workshop.
Okay.
Otherwise it's mainly been kind of more mindfulness meditation, right? Like John
Yeah.
Kabat-Zinn sort of stuff. And so it was so interesting because it was just all so different. I think just, the thing about Zen that comes up for me, it's just like a much more of a formal type practice, like everyone's
Yeah.
very serious. They've got their robes, like, we had to clean the
It can be.
bathrooms. I don't know. It's just
Yeah, yeah.
like,
No, no. I mean that's a more traditional sort of practice, and that's yeah. I do both myself. Both of my teachers were into a kind of informal sort of practice where my teacher in Japan liked to wear robes, but he didn't care if anybody else did. So he would kind of show up in his robes, but he didn't worry about other people. My teacher in America never even wore the robes. So we would just meet in his living room and set out a bunch of cushions and sit there. And that's kind of my normal practice is like that. We finally started renting a space here in Los Angeles, and that's what we do. We've emptied out the living room of a house, and we just get there together and sit. and sit on some cushions for a while and then have a little bit of tea and have a talk. But that other sort of more formal practice is also useful. And I think pretty much that's always been the tradition. We hear a lot about the monastic tradition, which is, very rigid. And you're talking about, going and cleaning the toilets. That's actually usually part of the practice in a monastery. You clean and do all these things. But there's also a practice where you just, like I do every day, like I just did about an hour ago. I get up and I put a cushion on the floor and I sit there for a while, and I don't really do any formalities around it.
Yeah, yeah. No, I like that because I think more people could relate to that. And I totally hear what you're saying about it was like part of the practice of like, cleaning the toilets. But I remember like here we are, we've paid so much to like see this writing teacher. And then we're like,
Yeah.
and now we get to clean the toilet. It was just a random experience. But I think everyone really actually appreciated and enjoyed the experience and the setting. And I love that they wear
Yeah, I
all
know what you mean.
black.
The black is good because the black is very conducive to the experience. But I found that if you require, ordinary people to show up in black, you won't get, you'll either get it, they won't do it, or they'll come out in really weird goth clothes, which are not usually appropriate for the practice. So,
Yeah, I like it because I tend to wear a lot of black. And so it was one of those things I was like, oh my God, I fit in here and in ballet class. It was like,
that's good. Yeah. I think ballet clothing would be perfect for Zen.
totally. I mean, absolutely so comfy. One of the other pieces, like, I'm curious because I feel like, with the name of your kind of banner, like business, the hardcore Zen, and like, I feel like your approach, like, it has this kind of like, what's the word I'm looking for? Just it's like irreverent, but in a cool way. Like, I don't mean that like dismissive, but sort of tone. And I'm curious, how has that worked for you kind of within the community? Has that been challenging or?
Ah, it's an interesting question. I don't think it's been that challenging. It's kind of funny. The name Hardcore Zen was that comes from my first book was called Hardcore Zen, but I didn't even make up that title. My publishers, came up with that title and I liked it. It was kind of cool, um, but now I'm kind of stuck with this thing that I didn't even come up with. But it sort of comes out of the punk scene because I was playing in a hardcore punk band, and then I became a Zen monk, so hardcore Zen made sense. Um, the irreverence, I think, has always been part of Zen. So there's a long tradition in Zen of these sort of teachers who kind of buck the system, but are nonetheless accepted as part of the system. So I was lucky enough to study with two of those teachers who are both kind of on the outs with the mainstream of Zen. My first teacher kind of didn't pay any attention at all to the mainstream of Zen, and my other teacher in Japan, even though he was ordained by the head of one of the big Zen organizations in Japan, he used to call that organization a guild of funeral directors, and he didn't like them at all. But he was part of the organization, and they accepted him, and they even, like I said, their head of that organization ordained him. So knowing that they were going to get this guy in the mix of things who was going to shake things up, I think is kind of considered to be a value within the Zen tradition. And one of the things I'm a little concerned about as it transitions into America is that that aspect of it isn't quite well understood over here. So I do get a bit of flack from people who don't understand that this is actually part of the tradition, is to challenge the tradition. So
Ah,
yeah.
okay, that's helpful. That's good to know. Yeah, I was like, is he just like a little rogue or, you know?
I think I'm actually pretty traditional when it comes down to it. The way I teach and the way I practice is really actually pretty traditional. But the approach and having the cartoons on the covers of the books and having the funny titles and things like that, it gets attention, and it's the way I naturally express this. So if I tried to do it the normal way, it would come out phony. So it's a way of being honest too.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. It's like presenting as who you are versus performing.
Yeah.
I'm curious, is there any other question or, kind of topic that you're like, ooh, I wish I'd included this in the book?
Uh, you know, there's a lot. What I've been doing lately is I've put out a podcast called Letters to a Dead Friend about Zen because I realized that there were more questions, and so the letters, it's a literary conceit, I guess is the official word for that. So they're not actual letters that I'm writing to my friend, obviously, but I did try to write them honestly in terms of I tried to write these letters as if this friend of mine who passed away could actually read them. I didn't want to put anything in there that I wouldn't put in if I was speaking directly to him and thought he could read it. So I just decided, well, that can go a lot further. So I've done, let's see, I think I've got 6 episodes of the podcast out already, and I'm going to keep doing them. So there are a lot of things that have come up since then. It's hard to come up with anything right off the top of my head, but I don't know. The latest one I did that I don't think I've put out yet, I did it at a New Age bookstore, with a lot of these crystals and, all this stuff around. And I decided, well, let's see what I can say about that. Because Zen, the teacher who founded the form of Zen that I study was called a mystical realist, which I think is an interesting thing because he has the mystical side to him and he has the realist side to him. And a lot of people miss one or the other, and Zen tries to bring those two into contact with each other without conflicting or denying each other, which I think is a very interesting thing. And I'm trying to come up with a book right now that addresses that, and I haven't quite got there, but I'm working on it.
Yeah, well, because did you say it's your eighth book, this one?
I believe it's number 8. Yeah, I'd have to go back and count them to be sure, but it's like 7 or 8. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's amazing. Is there
Yeah, I
any,
didn't expect to have a career.
excuse me?
I didn't expect to have a career out of this. That's the funny thing. When I put out the first book about Zen, I thought, well, that's it. I've done my book about Zen. Now I'll go do something else. But now it's become a career.
Yeah, no, it's amazing because it's like they're all, clearly similarly aligned, but different spins, which is, it's great. It's great to see. And you probably get questions from people, what about this? What about that? And you're like, oh, that
Yeah,
could be a book or a
yeah,
podcast or yeah.
yeah.
Well, is there anything else that you'd like to share with listeners about letters to a dead friend about Zen? And listeners, I'll definitely have a link to his podcast in the show notes.
Yeah, I can't think of anything else. This has been a really good interview. I just hope people, if the book sounds intriguing, I hope you read it and see if it resonates, because I feel like this is the strongest book I've ever put out, and it was surprising because when I started working on it, I wasn't sure I would even be able to finish it because it was very kind of raw and emotional when I wrote it. And the tradition in Zen is to be very kind of cool and a little bit detached when you write. And so this isn't like that at all. So I hope it conveys what I wanted it to convey, or that it conveys something of value to the people who read it.
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. And it makes sense too that this one would be quite raw. I mean, considering, the topic and what
Yeah.
led you to write it. And so there's something so, I think, juicy about whenever people do write with strong emotion. It just makes the book even more alive.
Yeah, yeah, it's been funny. I read the book in order to do the audio book. I read the chapters aloud to audiences in Europe and recorded it. And getting this like live audience reaction really surprised me because it was much more intense than previous talks that I'd given over there. So that was interesting.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of grief and attachment and all of that, I think, is always, trigger points for people in a good way, but yeah. Well, my last question for you, Brad, is the name of this podcast is Tranquility du Jour. So I think I know the answer to this, but how do you find tranquility in your everyday?
Well, yeah, probably the answer you're expecting is I do zazen every day, and that's what I do. And it's not always tranquil, but even when I'm not feeling particularly tranquil, I will go and sit and do my meditation anyway. And that's been extremely valuable. So, obviously when my friend was dying and I was traveling Europe I was doing retreats and things. So I was sitting a lot of Zazen with the backdrop of this friend of mine dying, going on. So, I would encourage people to do, if you're committed to a practice, a meditation or whatever it is, keep doing it, even if you don't feel like it. Because I think those are sometimes the best meditation sessions for me are the ones where I don't feel like doing it.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a great reminder. Well, thank you so much, Brad, for being here with us and for writing this lovely book, Letters to a Dead Friend, about Zen. And I wish you a wonderful weekend ahead.
Yeah, thank you for having me on. I appreciate it. I do a lot of interviews, and this was a good one. So thank you a lot.
Absolutely. So you can find Brad on Facebook at Brad Warner Hardcore Zen, Twitter at Brad Warner, YouTube at Doubtboy, and I also have a link to his website where you can find out more about his books. So let's connect. Join our Tranquility du Jour Insiders Facebook group. There is a link in the show notes. Here's where I share resources, get inspiration, announce the new online book club pick. Hello, September, right around the corner. And it's a great way to make connections with other tranquility-seeking, lovely ladies and a few amazing men. If you're new to Tranquility du Jour, there is a link to learn more. And also sign up for weekly Inbox Love, which are love notes where you get inspiration, invites, and more. There's also a link to browse my 6 books and planner, follow along on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube, and shop the seasonless, vegan, locally made, eco-friendly fashion line Tranquility, soon to transition into TDJ by Kimberly and under the Kimberly Wilson website. Also, if you have a moment to share a review of this podcast or any of my books, I would be so grateful. And you can find out more details at kimberlywilson.com/review. So thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you for inviting me and my guest into your day. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode. And I wish you a wonderful week ahead. Mm-hmm.